It's my body. You can't demand anything from me. My name is Thomas Falkenberg. I'm 33 years old and have been teaching third grade at the elementary school on Birkenweg in Stuttgart, Baden-Württemberg for 8 years. When my wife, Sandra Lehmann, spoke these words, we had been married exactly 5 weeks and 2 days. During that entire time, she hadn't touched me even once. Not a single kiss lasting longer than a second. No holding hands while watching TV together. Nothing at all. I sat there on our brown leather sofa, the one I'd bought 3 years earlier, convinced I'd remain alone forever, and tried to understand what she meant. We'd been a couple for 14 months. We'd talked about everything. We'd been intimate before our wedding. We'd even lived together for half a year before saying yes in St. Catherine Chapel. Yet in that precise moment, something changed. Sandra, I'm not demanding anything from you. I'm just asking why you won't even give me a goodnight kiss. She didn't even look up, continuing to scroll on her phone instead. I told you, my body, my choice. Lately, that had become her standard reply whenever I'd suggested sharing our bed instead of her sleeping in the guest room, when I'd reach for her hand at my parents' house, or when I'd proposed a weekend getaway to celebrate our first month as a married couple. I respect that completely, I said, but we're married. Then you were simply mistaken. She still wouldn't meet my eyes. I went to the kitchen and made myself a sandwich whole grain bread with turkey breast and cheese, the same one I'd been eating for lunch at school since September. As I chewed, it dawned on me that something had been bothering me for weeks. Back in March, during one of our premarital counseling sessions with Pastor Norbert Kuhn, Sandra had said something that kept replaying in my mind. She'd hinted that marriage was more about security and partnership than physical intimacy. At the time, I'd assumed she meant we shared a deeper connection beyond mere attraction. But now, standing there with an empty mayonnaise jar I'd forgotten to replace, I wondered if I'd missed something crucial. The woman in the living room felt like a stranger. The Sandra I'd known would cuddle up to me during movies. She'd laugh at my terrible jokes about fractions and division. On Saturday mornings, she'd get up early to make coffee and sit with me while I graded papers. This Sandra, however, seemed to barely tolerate my presence. And something in her voice when she said, "Then you were simply mistaken," made me realize this wasn't temporary. It was her plan all along. I'd met Sandra 2 years ago at an October teachers conference. She worked as a social pedagogue for the school board, handling difficult family situations where teachers like me hit a wall. She was quiet, thoughtful, and had a way of listening that made you feel truly understood. When she smiled, which wasn't often, it felt like a gift. Our first date was at a cafe downtown. We talked for 3 hours about everything except work. She told me about growing up in a small Thuringian town, her parents divorced when she was 12, and how she learned early on that people aren't always what they seem. I shared how my father died while I was in university, how teaching pulled me out of a dark place, and how I'd nearly given up hope of finding a woman who understood that my profession meant more than just a paycheck. The first year seemed perfect. She attended school events, chatted easily with my colleagues, and my mother liked her instantly, a big deal, considering my mother always had opinions about every woman I'd ever brought home. Sandra fit into my life as if it had always been meant to be, but in hindsight, I recognized the warning signs I'd ignored. She never wanted to discuss concrete future plans, only vague notions about building something stable. When we moved in together last summer, she insisted on keeping separate bank accounts and splitting all expenses exactly in half, even though I earned more and had repeatedly offered to cover a larger share. During our engagement, she seemed far more interested in wedding preparations than in marriage itself. She'd spend hours researching venues and flowers, but if I brought up honeymoons or future plans, she'd immediately change the subject. When I suggested having children in a few years, she merely nodded and said, "We'll see." The biggest red flag came during our final counseling session in August. Pastor Norbert Kuhn asked what we were most looking forward to in marriage. I spoke about building a family and growing old together. Sandra said she looked forward to a stable foundation. When he pressed her, she explained, "Marriage gives me the security to focus on my professional goals." At the time, I thought it was just pragmatism. Sandra had always been more reserved than I was, careful with her words. I assumed she was simply nervous about sharing such big things with a stranger. But now, watching her scroll through her phone as if I were invisible, I understood. That wasn't nervousness, it was honesty. She hadn't married me out of love. She'd married me for stability. And the tenderness she'd shown during our relationship, it was just a role she'd played to execute her plan. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in November. I'd cooked dinner. We ate in silence, and she immediately retreated to the guest room to read afterward. I sat in the living room, staring at the wall where we'd hung our wedding photos just 6 weeks earlier, wondering what to do. Then I remembered something. During our counseling sessions, Pastor Norbert Kuhn had recorded our conversations for his records. He'd obtained our consent at the time, explaining he sometimes used the recordings to better assist couples. Sandra had agreed, and we'd both signed the forms. The next day during my lunch break, I called Pastor Norbert Kuhn. "Thomas, good to hear from you. How's married life treating you and Sandra?" "That's exactly why I'm calling," I said. "I need to ask you about those session recordings." A pause. "Is everything all right?" "I think Sandra wasn't honest about her intentions during our counseling. I need to know if those recordings still exist." Kuhn fell silent for a moment. "My son, that's a serious accusation. What makes you suspect this?" "Last night she told me she never intended to have a physical relationship with me after the wedding. She said she married me for security, not love." "Oh, Thomas." His voice grew quiet. "Yes, I still have the recordings. They're kept for 6 months after a couple completes counseling. If you're considering legal action, you should know you both consented to the recordings. That means they could be used as evidence." That evening, I sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. Sandra was in the kitchen reheating leftover soup. "Sandra, we need to talk." She didn't look up from the stove. "About what?" "About what you said in premarital counseling, that marriage means security to you, not physical closeness." She turned around. For the first time in weeks, I had her full attention. "And Kuhn recorded those sessions. You said things there that contradict everything you're telling me now." Her face went pale. "You wouldn't do that." "Do what?" "Use those recordings against me. They're private. I looked at this woman I thought I knew, the person I'd sworn loyalty and love to, and realized I didn't recognize her at all. Sandra, did you ever truly intend to have a real marriage with me?" She set down the spoon and crossed her arms. "I gave you what I promised. A wife, a partnership. If you expected more, that's your problem." I nodded slowly. Okay. "What does that mean?" "That I understand now." I went to the bedroom, pulled out my laptop, and started researching marriage annulments in Baden-Württemberg. If Sandra wanted a business arrangement, she needed to learn that contracts can be voided when entered into through deception and misrepresentation. On a Friday morning in December, I filed for annulment on grounds of fraud prior to marriage. That same evening, I handed Sandra the documents personally when she came home from work. She read them twice, then looked up with an expression I'd never seen before. Pure fury. "You're really doing this over sex?" "This isn't about sex, Sandra. It's about honesty. You lied to me about your views on marriage." She slammed the papers onto the counter. "I never lied about anything. I told you I valued stability and partnership. You told Kuhn physical closeness meant nothing to you in marriage. You said you were marrying me because I'm safe and reliable, not because you love me. You said those exact words in our July session." Her face tightened. "Those conversations were supposed to be confidential. They were confidential until you decided to destroy our marriage 5 weeks after the wedding." Sandra spent the weekend on the phone. I heard her voice through the guest room door, but couldn't make out the words. On Monday morning, she was waiting in the kitchen with coffee and toast, the first breakfast she'd made since our honeymoon. "Thomas, I think we got off on the wrong foot. Marriage takes time to settle in. Maybe we can fix this." I looked at this woman who hadn't touched me in over a month and was suddenly willing to discuss reconciliation the moment legal papers appeared. "What changed your mind?" "I realize I might have been too harsh. Physical closeness is important in marriage. We can work on it." "Work on it? How?" She stepped closer, placing her hand on my arm. "However you want. I was just unsettled. Marriage is a big step." For a moment, I almost believed her. This was the Sandra I'd once dated, the woman who'd convinced me she wanted more than just security. But then I remembered her words from Tuesday night. "If you expected more, that's your problem." "Sandra, why are you suddenly changing your stance?" "I'm not changing anything. I'm trying to save our marriage." "No," I said gently, removing her hand from my arm. "You're just trying to avoid the legal consequences of fraud." Her expression hardened. "Fine. If you want the hard way, my lawyer says you'll never prove fraud. It's your word against mine, and I'll testify in court that you're lying." "Your lawyer?" "Yes. I hired legal counsel over the weekend. He says this is just your revenge campaign because you can't handle rejection. He believes the court will see you're trying to punish your wife for exercising autonomy over her own body." I nodded slowly. Okay. "What does that mean?" "That I understand your strategy. You'll paint me as controlling and aggressive." For the first time in months, Sandra smiled, but it wasn't the smile I'd fallen for. The truth is the truth, Thomas. You filed for annulment because I wouldn't sleep with you. How do you think that looks? That evening, I called my own lawyer, Gabriele Scherer, who'd handled my father's estate 5 years earlier. I explained the situation and asked her to review my annulment petition. Thomas, you need to understand, she said. Annulment cases are difficult to prove, especially when the other side denies wrongdoing. Are you absolutely certain you have evidence to support your claims? Yes, I have recordings where Sandra admits she didn't marry me out of love, but for financial security. She explicitly states physical intimacy wasn't part of her expectations for marriage. And you have legal access to these recordings? Yes, we both consented to the recordings, and Kuhn confirmed they can be used as evidence. Gabriele was silent for a moment. Then you may have a stronger case than her lawyers realize. The next morning, I drove to Kuhn's office to collect copies of our session recordings. He greeted me with a concerned expression and handed me a brown envelope. Thomas, I want you to know I prayed about this. I believe these recordings will help reveal the truth, but I'm sorry it's come to this. What do you mean? He handed me the envelope. After your call, I listened to the sessions again. Back then, I didn't understand everything. Now it all makes sense. That evening, I sat alone in my classroom and listened to 6 hours of counseling sessions. What I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about my wife. In our third session in June, Kuhn asked Sandra about her past relationships. She explained she'd dated several men over the years, but they'd all demanded too much emotional closeness. She preferred relationships where she could maintain independence and focus on her career. When asked what she hoped for in a husband, she replied coldly, "Someone stable who won't make emotional demands on me. Someone who provides security without expecting me to be something I'm not." Kuhn asked, "Do you understand that marriage typically involves emotional and physical intimacy?" Sandra answered, "I believe Thomas will be satisfied with companionship and partnership. He's not the type to pressure me into things that make me uncomfortable." In the fifth session, it went even deeper. Kuhn asked us both about our expectations regarding marriage, intimacy, children, and the future. I spoke of family, children, and a shared life. Sandra, however, described marriage as a practical arrangement between two adults who respect each other's boundaries. When Kuhn asked about those boundaries, she said, "I need someone who understands I'm not physically affectionate. I can be a good wife in terms of partnership and household management, but I don't want to be pressured into romantic expectations that don't suit me." When asked if she'd openly discussed this with me, she didn't answer directly but said, "I've given him signals. If he didn't understand them, we'll talk after the wedding." In our final session in August, it became crystal clear. Sandra said she looked forward to the security of marriage and was confident I'd respect her desire for distance. When Kuhn pressed her on what she meant, she explained she wanted to keep separate bedrooms after the wedding. I sat in the dark classroom for an hour afterward. Sandra hadn't just omitted something. She'd deceived me from the very beginning. She'd counted on me being too kind, too accommodating, too lonely to demand honesty. She didn't want a husband. She wanted a roommate to split bills with and gain social respectability without ever having to give anything in return. But she'd made one mistake. She'd been too honest in those sessions, believing her words would never see the light of day. That weekend, I organized all documents and prepared for legal battle. On Monday, I met with Gabriele Scherer to review the recordings together. She listened to selected passages, took notes, and shook her head repeatedly. Finally, she leaned back and looked at me, almost incredulous. "Thomas, in 20 years of family law, I've never seen such clear evidence of premarital fraud. Your wife has repeatedly admitted to deliberate misconduct. What does this mean for the annulment?" "It means we don't just have a chance. We'll win this case decisively, especially with documented evidence." Before we proceed further, please subscribe to our channel and comment below which city you're watching from. She outlined the next steps. We'd file a motion to admit the recordings as evidence, along with a detailed chronology of Sandra's behavior. We'd also request that Sandra bear all legal costs and return any gifts or benefits obtained through deception. "One more thing," Gabriele added. "If Sandra's lawyer claims this is about coercion or abuse, these recordings completely disprove that. She repeatedly states she never wanted a physical relationship and married you precisely for that reason." That evening, Sandra was waiting for me at home. She'd cooked and set the table with our wedding china, something she hadn't done since our wedding day. "Thomas, I've thought about what you said. Maybe we should go to counseling together and try again." I sat at the table and examined the elaborate meal. Roast beef with vegetables, homemade bread, and apple strudel for dessert. "When did you make all this?" "I took the afternoon off. I wanted to show you our marriage matters to me, that I'm willing to make an effort." I took a bite of the roast. It was excellent, probably the best she'd ever cooked. This tastes really good. She smiled, appearing genuinely happy for a moment. I'm glad you like it. Maybe we can start over. Let's leave all this legal stuff behind and build something real. Sandra, why now? Why didn't you want to build something real 2 months ago? Her smile faltered. I told you, I was scared. Marriage is a big adjustment. No, I said quietly. You weren't scared. You got exactly what you wanted. A husband who pays half the bills and otherwise leaves you alone. That's not true. I pulled out my phone and played a 30-second clip. Sandra's voice filled the dining room. I need someone who understands I'm not physically affectionate. I can be a good wife in terms of partnership and household management, but I don't want to be pressured into romantic expectations that don't suit me. Sandra's face drained of color. She jumped up, knocking her chair over. You can't use that. Those were private conversations. Those were conversations where you admitted exactly what you intended for our marriage. Thomas, please, we can work this out. I'll do anything you want. I looked at this woman who'd refused every touch for 2 months, yet was suddenly willing to do anything now that her lies were exposed. Sandra, what I want is an honest marriage, and you can't give me that. The court hearing took place on a cold January morning at Stuttgart District Court. Sandra appeared with her lawyer, a confident-looking man who radiated assurance despite the overwhelming evidence. Judge Marianne Hoffman called the case. First, Sandra's lawyer spoke. Your Honor, this annulment petition is nothing but an attempt to punish my client for maintaining her boundaries in marriage. Mr. Falkenberg is trying to legally compel his wife to fulfill his physical demands. This must not set a precedent. He portrayed Sandra as a victim of marital pressure, a woman defending herself against her husband's expectations. Then Gabriele Scherer rose. Your Honor, I move to admit audio recordings that completely refute the opposing counsel's claims. She played selected passages, including Sandra's statements that she'd married Thomas solely for security and never intended to have a genuine marriage. The courtroom fell silent as Sandra's voice echoed through the room. Judge Hoffman looked directly at Sandra. Ms. Lehman, these recordings suggest you entered this marriage with no intention of fulfilling fundamental marital obligations. Do you dispute their authenticity? Sandra's lawyer whispered something to her, but she shook her head. No, Your Honor, but I was just being honest about my feelings. Honest with the pastor, but not with your husband. Sandra remained silent. The judge delivered her verdict without hesitation. The marriage is annulled. Ms. Lehman committed fraud and misrepresentation by concealing her true intentions. Furthermore, I order that all gifts be returned and that Ms. Lehman bear all court costs and attorney fees. Marriage is a contract based on mutual trust. Those who deliberately enter this contract with false intentions must face the consequences. Sandra's composure shattered. Not only was our marriage annulled, but she also had to return all wedding gifts and cover all costs. Outside the courthouse, she approached me one last time. Thomas, I'm sorry. I never wanted it to come to this. I looked at her for the final time. But Sandra, you did want this. You just didn't expect to get caught. Within a month, word spread everywhere in our school, among friends everywhere. Teachers who'd once admired Sandra's apparent devotion now understood why she'd seemed so distant. Parents no longer wanted her working with their children as a social pedagogue. Eventually, on her superior's advice, she transferred to another department. 6 months later, I heard she'd moved back to Thuringia. Stuttgart could no longer hold her. Her reputation was ruined. For me, however, an important lesson remained. Never confuse understanding with naivety. I'd mistaken Sandra's calculation for thoughtfulness and her coldness for depth. When I eventually started dating again, I knew what truly mattered: honesty. Sandra had wanted security without love, partnership without closeness, marriage without commitment. What she got was proof that deception has consequences, even in matters of the heart. Now it's your turn. Comment below what you would have done in Thomas's place. Which city are you watching from? And share this story with someone going through something similar. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story about betrayal, revenge, and truth.